Every company needs and uses metrics. The problems arise when the metrics are not clearly defined and not standardized. And what I've described there is almost always the case. Usually it starts with a single metric by a given name, defined a certain way, floating around an organization, clashes with another metric of the same name and a different definition. Before too long, we have a small chaos brewing. We're not sure which metric to rely upon for specific decisions. This is consistently a challenge at the executive level in terms of intelligence management and understanding which metrics we can actually rely upon to make decisions. The metrics are only as strong as our confidence in them. So, as part of the Hawkwin Insight training, we really emphasize metric definition and clarity. We do this with the help of the Hawkwin Inquiry Framework to probe into the context, reasoning, purpose of the metric. And the data that we generate as part of the framework winds up being a source of truth in its own that states the entire reasoning for the metric. Some of the important questions we have to consider with a metric, first of all, at the high level, how important is it to the overall success of the organization? We ultimately have to put a grade on its importance in terms of the overall performance of the organization. How important is this metric? Does it tell us something vitally important, or is it more of a tangential metric? Second of all, what team is responsible for the metric? Not which team owns the construction and delivery of the metric, but what team is responsible for the movement in the metric. For a lot of the larger metrics, this might be an amalgam, it might be a number of teams contributing to something, but it's helpful to pin down that one team that actually is responsible at the end of the day. For some things that are obvious, like sales leads, it would be clear that the sales team owns the movement of that metric. For other things like churn rate, it's probably a number of teams working together, but it's helpful to pin down that one team that takes responsibility. Speaking of churn rate, this is a very difficult metric as an example for organizations to get right. Why is this? There are a lot of arbitrary parameters assigned to the churn rate metric. How long the user has to be absent before he or she is considered churn, for example. Is it a cohort-based churn, or is it some other churn based on activity in a given week? There are a lot of arbitrary parameters, and I think a lot of the challenges arise for standardizing metrics like this when different teams want to apply different parameters to the metric. Again, this is something that should be supported with analytical research. In all cases, we should have analytical research to support the parameters we put into place, whether churn means someone's gone for 6 days or 6 months. And also, it's perfectly fine for us to have numerous churn definitions as long as they're named very clearly. So naming conventions are critical. Other questions we want to entertain when we're building a new metric or enhancing a metric. Well, of course, how is it constructed? What's the definition? The actual code definition, as well as a pseudocode definition just to express the logic. And most importantly, the layman's definition, so anyone can understand it and talk about it. From here, we have to move backwards to the actual data attributes that are included in the construction of this metric. Are these proprietary data metrics? Are data attributes? Are these coming from elsewhere? How confident are we in the underlying attributes? Have we removed outliers? Should we remove outliers? How consistent is the data feed? Are we relying upon some upstream process to produce it? Are there likely to be changes in the way this data is assembled down the road with version changes? Are there other metrics in the company that are similar but different? And what are the pros and cons of how those are defined? These are some of the questions we have to go through as we consider a new metric. And when we're done going through a framework like this, we have a record of our reasoning. We've also informed ourselves as to the context and purpose of this metric, how it fits in, some of the actions that come about if the metric increases or decreases by a certain threshold, and what are those thresholds. This is the body of knowledge we need before we can really express a metric. Usually someone builds a metric, posts it, and then it's just a living, breathing thing inside of a company without having done that setup work that we need to do in the inquiry framework. This is a very common problem, and it's actually not hard to nail down your metrics as long as there's that record of thinking through it answering the questions, the person who goes through this framework will be the best in position to raise these issues, to drive clarity on the metric. This is a key component of success in the company, is how clear the metrics are, how well we understand them, how well we communicate them. Are we all talking about the same thing? If we can accomplish this, then we've already covered a tremendous amount of ground.